My mother fed me, and my sister expired food for 15 years while my golden child brother got fresh meals. Now she's demanding we pay for her retirement home? My mother gave me and my sister expired food for our entire childhood, while my older brother Keith got fresh food. Started when I was 6, and my sister Colleen was 4. Keith was 10, and Mom's obvious favorite. He played football, looked like Dad before Dad left, and got straight A's without trying. Mom would go grocery shopping every Saturday, come home with bags of fresh meat, vegetables, bread, and milk for the main kitchen. Then she'd pull out a separate bag for Colleen and me. Dented cans, bread with mold spots, milk one day from expiring. The yogurt has already passed its expiration date. She'd put our food in the basement fridge and tell us that's where our food was. Keith ate from the upstairs kitchen. We ate from the basement. If we tried to take anything from upstairs, she'd scream at us for stealing Keith's food. I got food poisoning at 8 from expired lunch meat. Threw up for 3 days. Mom said I was being dramatic. Colleen got sick from bad milk at 7. Mom said she probably caught something at school. When teachers asked why our lunches smelled funny, Mom told them we were picky eaters who only liked aged cheese and fermented foods. Keith would bring friends over, and Mom would cook them steak dinners while Colleen and I ate expired soup in the basement. She'd tell everyone we had sensitive stomachs and needed special food. But here's what Mom didn't plan on. Getting sick that often built up my immune system like crazy. By high school, I never missed a day. Perfect attendance got me scholarship opportunities. I also learned to cook everything from scratch because I had to make expired ingredients taste decent. Became obsessed with food safety, nutrition, and preservation techniques. Got into culinary school on a full ride. Colleen went into nursing, specifically pediatric nutrition. She wanted to make sure no kid went through what we did. Keith peaked in high school, failed out of college, moved back home at 22 and never left. Now he's 38, still in Mom's house, working part-time at a hardware store. I became head chef at a 5-star restaurant by 28. Opened my own place at 32. Got reviewed in the Times. 3 locations now. Colleen runs a whole pediatric nutrition program at the Children's Hospital. We both cut Mom off the day we turned 18. Haven't been back to that house in 15 years. Mom never called, never apologized, nothing. Then last week she showed up at my restaurant. Not to eat, not to congratulate me. She needs money. Turns out Keith can't support her anymore. The house needs repairs. Her social security isn't enough. She wants me and Colleen to pay for a retirement home. A nice one. She already picked it out. $8,000 a month. She figures Colleen and I can split it since we're so successful. I raised you, she says. I kept a roof over your heads. Fed you every day. Now it's your turn to take care of me. I actually laughed. Right there in my own restaurant. Fed us? She fed us garbage while treating Keith like royalty. The sous chef Carlos looked concerned. I waved him off. Told Mom I needed to check something in the kitchen. Instead, I called Colleen. Told her to meet me at Mom's house tomorrow with her husband. Then I called my lawyer friend Russell. Asked him to write up something special. The next day, Colleen, her husband Jack, Russell and I showed up at Mom's house. Keith answered the door in his bathrobe at 2 p.m. The house smelled like mildew. Mom was in the living room, already talking about payment schedules for the retirement home. I handed her the paper Russell prepared. "What's this?" she asked. "An invoice," I said. "For all the medical bills from food poisoning. Therapy for the eating disorders Colleen developed. Dental work from malnutrition. Comes to $87,000. Pay that and we'll talk about your retirement." She went white. Started sputtering about ungrateful children, about everything she sacrificed. Colleen cut her off. "You fed us expired food for 15 years while Keith ate like a king. You know what I found when I was 14? Your grocery receipts? You were buying our expired food on purpose from a discount salvage store, saving money on feeding your daughters so Keith could have name brand everything." Keith looked confused. "What expired food?" Mom never told him. He actually thought we had special dietary needs all those years. I pulled out my phone and showed him photos. "Remember when you had friends over for your 16th birthday? Steak dinner upstairs? Colleen and I ate expired canned ravioli in the basement. Mom told you we were at a sleepover. We were in the basement the whole time." Keith's face went from confusion to horror. He looked at Mom. "You fed them expired food?" Mom's face turned white, then red, then white again. She reached for Keith's arm, but he pulled back so fast he nearly stumbled. The look he gave her was something I'd never seen before, like he was staring at a stranger. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. Then the words started tumbling over each other, fast and desperate. She was just trying to be practical, she said, making tough choices as a single mother with 3 kids and no help from anyone. The food was perfectly safe, she insisted, just past some random date printed on a label that didn't mean anything. We were always so picky anyway, turning our noses up at everything. So what was the point of wasting good money on food we'd complain about? Keith kept staring at her, his mouth slightly open, his eyes doing this thing where they kept getting wider and wider. Colleen's voice cut through the room like a blade. I'd never heard my sister sound like that before, cold and sharp and absolutely done with everything. She pulled out her phone and started swiping through photos. She held the screen up to Keith's face. Moldy bread with green and white fuzz spreading across the crust. Cans so bloated the metal bulged outward. Milk with chunks floating in yellowish liquid. Yogurt with a layer of something dark and wet on top. Keith looked at each photo, his face getting paler with every swipe. Mom started talking again, louder this time, saying those photos were fake or exaggerated or taken out of context. But Colleen just kept swiping, showing him more and more evidence of what we ate for 15 years. Keith suddenly turned and ran for the bathroom. We heard him throw up, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Mom yelled after him that we were being dramatic, that we were manipulating him, that we were turning her son against her with lies and made-up stories. Russell shifted beside me, and I could feel his lawyer instincts kicking in, probably cataloging everything Mom said for future reference. I spoke up then, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. We have documentation of everything, I told Mom. Medical records from all the times I got food poisoning that she dismissed as me being dramatic. Hospital visits for Colleen's stomach issues. Dental records showing the damage from malnutrition. Russell added that we also have testimony from teachers who noticed our lunches and remembered Mom's explanations about our supposed special dietary needs. Mom's face twisted into something ugly, all her careful mask sliding away. Keith came back from the bathroom looking like he might pass out. His skin had this gray tinge to it and he was breathing hard. He walked straight to Mom and asked her directly if it was true. Did she really buy our food from a salvage store on purpose? Mom didn't answer. She just stood there with her mouth pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting between Keith and the door like she was calculating an escape route. Keith sat down heavily on the couch and put his head in his hands. Jack spoke for the first time since we'd arrived. As a pediatrician, he said in this calm, professional voice, he'd seen cases of child neglect before. This absolutely qualified as deliberate abuse. Withholding adequate nutrition from children while providing it for another child showed clear favoritism and intentional harm. Mom whipped around to face him, her voice going shrill. He was an outsider, she said. He had no right to judge her parenting choices. He didn't know what it was like to raise 3 kids alone with barely any money. Jack didn't respond, just stood there with his hand on Colleen's shoulder. Colleen stood up and announced we were leaving. Mom shouldn't expect any money from us for her retirement home or anything else. Mom's expression changed instantly from angry to panicked. She started talking about being homeless, about having nowhere to go, about how we couldn't just abandon her. Keith suddenly asked how much money she saved. His voice was quiet, but it cut through Mom's panic like scissors through paper. How much money did she save by feeding us expired food instead of fresh food like she bought for him? The question just hung there in the air. Mom couldn't answer. Her mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. We walked toward the door and Mom started screaming. "Ungrateful daughters," she yelled. After everything she sacrificed for us. We were abandoning her in her time of need. We were leaving her to die alone. Russell opened the door and we filed out one by one. Keith didn't follow us. Through the window, I could see him still sitting on that couch, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Mom's voice followed us all the way to our cars, getting higher and more desperate with every step we took away from that house. We got in our cars, and I watched Colleen collapse against Jack in the passenger seat. Her whole body shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. Jack wrapped both arms around her and just held on while she cried into his shoulder. I stood there by my car door watching them through their windshield and felt nothing. Like my body was there in that parking lot, but my brain was somewhere else entirely. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out without really thinking about it. Carlos had sent a text asking if I was okay, and if he should handle the dinner prep without me. Something about seeing his name on my screen made everything crash back into focus. My hands started shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. I texted back that I needed an hour and would be there soon. Russell walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. He said he'd send Mom an official cease and desist letter, making it clear that any further contact would result in a restraining order. Then he suggested we might want to report the childhood abuse to Adult Protective Services. Not for prosecution since too much time had passed, but to create an official record in case Mom tried anything else. I nodded and got in my car before he could see my face doing whatever it was doing. Colleen was still crying when I drove past their car. 2 days went by where I buried myself in work and tried not to think about Mom's face or Keith sitting on that couch. Then right before dinner service on Tuesday, Carlos came back to my office looking uncomfortable. Keith was at the front asking to talk to me. I told Carlos to handle the kitchen and went out to find Keith standing by the host stand, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were red and his clothes looked slept in, and something in his face made me take him back to my office instead of telling him to leave. He sat down in the chair across from my desk and put a folder on the surface between us. He'd been going through Mom's financial records, found receipts going back 20 years from the salvage store where she bought our food. He opened the folder and spread them out so I could see. Rows and rows of receipts showing purchases of expired meat, dented cans, outdated dairy products. The amounts she saved added up to over $30,000. He'd cross-referenced them with other receipts and found where that money went. his sports equipment, his college attempts, his car. Every dollar she saved by feeding us garbage went straight to making his life better. Keith started crying right there in my office. Not quiet tears, but full-on sobbing that made his shoulders shake. He kept saying he never knew, and if he had known, he would have done something. I sat there watching him fall apart and wasn't sure I believed him. He was always Mom's favorite, and he liked it that way. He liked being the special one who got fresh food and new things and all of Mom's attention. But his horror seemed real. Like he was seeing his whole childhood from a different angle and realizing he was standing on top of our suffering the whole time. I realized he was another kind of victim of Mom's manipulation. She'd used him as a weapon against us without him even knowing it. I asked Keith what he wanted from me. My voice came out flat and tired. He looked up from his hands and said he didn't want anything except to understand why Mom did this to us. So I told him the truth. Mom resented having daughters. She saw Keith as the continuation of Dad and saw Colleen and me as burdens she was stuck with after Dad left. 2 extra mouths to feed that she never wanted in the first place. Every time she looked at us, she saw the life she could have had if she'd only had one kid. Keith's face went even paler if that was possible. He asked if there was any way to make this right. I was honest with him that I didn't know if there was. The damage was done and the childhood was gone. No amount of apologies or money could give us back those years of being hungry and sick and scared in that basement. No amount of sorry could undo the food poisoning or the stomach aches or the shame of bringing expired food to the school. He nodded like he expected that answer, but it still hurt to hear it. Keith told me he was moving out of Mom's house. He'd already started looking for apartments and had applications in at 3 different places. He was also done supporting Mom financially. His part-time paycheck was barely covering the utilities anyway, and now he knew where his whole childhood was spent. Every football cleat and Letterman jacket had been bought with money saved from our suffering. He couldn't live with that anymore. I believed him about that part at least. After Keith left, I sat in my office for a while just staring at those receipts spread across my desk. Then I called Colleen and told her about the conversation. She was quiet for a long time before saying anything. When she finally spoke, her voice was hard. She reminded me that Keith had 38 years to notice something was wrong and chose not to see it. He ate his fresh meals upstairs while we got sick in the basement and never once asked why. She wasn't ready to forgive him just because he finally opened his eyes. I told her I understood, and that I wasn't asking her to forgive him. I just wanted her to know what happened. The next week, Mom started calling my restaurant constantly. Carlos brought me a stack of message slips with increasingly desperate voicemails from her. Some begged me to reconsider and help her with the retirement home. Others threatened to tell everyone what terrible daughters we were for abandoning our mother. Some rambled about how she'd sacrificed everything for us, and this was how we repaid her. Carlos started screening my calls without me even asking him to. He'd answer the phone, and if it was Mom, he'd tell her I wasn't available and hang up. I was grateful for his protective instinct, even though I hated that my staff was witnessing this family mess play out. The line cooks had started giving me sympathetic looks, and the servers whispered in corners when they thought I couldn't hear them. Everyone knew something was wrong with the boss and her family. Russell filed the report with Adult Protective Services on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't know about it until the following Tuesday when my phone rang during prep work, and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something made me answer. The man on the other end introduced himself as Randolph Cross from Adult Protective Services. His voice was calm and professional, the kind of tone that puts people at ease even when discussing difficult topics. He explained that Russell had filed a report about Mom's past treatment of me and Colleen, and while they couldn't prosecute child abuse from decades ago, they wanted to talk to me about Mom's current situation and Keith's circumstances while he was living there. I told him I could meet him the next day at my restaurant after the lunch rush ended. He agreed and showed up at exactly 3 o'clock, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing a suit that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. We sat in my office and I spread out everything I'd gathered on my desk. The medical records from all those times I got food poisoning, each one noting my symptoms and Mom's explanations that the doctors had documented with increasing concern. The salvage store receipts Keith had found, showing years of purchases of expired and damaged food items. Photos of the basement fridge that I'd taken during one of my last visits home before cutting Mom off, back when I was documenting everything just in case I ever needed proof. Randolph went through each document slowly, his face staying professionally neutral, but I watched his eyes and saw the disgust there. He made notes in a small notebook, asking me questions about dates and details, about whether Mom had any current caregivers or support system. I told him about Keith moving out, about Mom's refusal to accept the subsidized housing options, about her insistence that Colleen and I owed her an expensive retirement home. When we finished going through everything, Randolph closed his notebook and looked at me directly. He said that Keith had already contacted them as well, providing information about Mom's current state of mind and financial situation. Apparently, Mom had been getting worse since our confrontation, her behavior swinging between rage and self-pity. She'd been calling Keith at all hours, sometimes screaming about ungrateful children and sometimes crying about dying alone. Keith had documented all of it, kept records of the calls and messages, and turned everything over to Adult Protective Services because he was worried about Mom's mental state. Randolph told me they were going to do a home visit to assess Mom's living conditions and mental health, but that their main concern was making sure she had access to appropriate resources. He couldn't force her to accept help, but they could make sure she knew what options were available. I thanked him for taking the situation seriously, and he shook my hand before leaving, telling me he'd be in touch after they completed their assessment. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was at home going over supplier invoices. Keith's name popped up on the screen and I hesitated before answering. His voice sounded different when I picked up, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. He told me he'd found an apartment, a tiny studio on the 3rd floor of an old building downtown. The rent was cheap because the place was small and the neighborhood wasn't great, but he said it felt like freedom even though it was smaller than his bedroom at Mom's house. He could walk to work from there, and the landlord had let him move in with just first month's rent since Keith had been working at the same hardware store for 10 years and had good references. He'd been there for a week already, and was still getting used to buying his own groceries and cooking his own meals. Then he told me about his therapist, a woman named Madeline Wagner who specialized in family trauma. She'd been helping him understand the dynamics that kept him blind for so long, explaining how Mom had manipulated him by making him the golden child while creating a separate reality for Colleen and me. Keith said it was hard to accept how much he'd missed, how many signs he'd ignored because it was easier to believe Mom's lies than to question why his sisters were always sick and eating different food. I listened without interrupting, letting him talk, and when he finished I told him I was glad he was getting help. The conversation ended awkwardly, neither of us sure how to bridge 30 years of different childhoods, but at least we were talking. Mom got my personal cell number somehow, probably from Keith before he moved out, or maybe from an old contact list. My phone buzzed with a text message at 11 at night, waking me up. The message was long, running into multiple texts, claiming she was going to be homeless, and it would be my fault when she died alone on the street. She wrote about how she'd sacrificed everything for us, how she'd worked herself to the bone to keep a roof over our heads, how ungrateful we were to abandon her now when she needed us most. The texts kept coming, each one more desperate and manipulative than the last. I screenshot every single message and sent them to Russell, who responded within minutes even though it was late. He told me he was adding everything to the harassment documentation, and that I should block her number. I did, and the silence afterwards felt like relief. Colleen called me the next morning suggesting we meet for lunch somewhere neutral, not at my restaurant where staff could overhear, and not at her house where Jack might feel obligated to mediate. We picked a small Italian place halfway between her hospital and my restaurant, the kind of spot that was always busy enough that no one paid attention to other people's conversations. She looked tired when she arrived, dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. We ordered salads neither of us really wanted, and she told me she'd been having nightmares about the basement fridge. She'd wake up in the middle of the night tasting expired milk, feeling 6 years old again and scared to ask for fresh food because Mom would yell at her for being ungrateful. The nightmares had started after our confrontation with Mom, like finally speaking the truth out loud, had unlocked something she'd kept buried for years. Jack had been supportive, but he didn't really understand. Couldn't understand what it was like to grow up thinking you were worth less than fresh food. I told her about my conversation with Keith and she listened without commenting, her face unreadable. When I finished, she said she wasn't ready to forgive him yet, that 38 years of willful ignorance couldn't be erased by a few weeks of therapy and guilt. I didn't argue with her because I understood where she was coming from, even if part of me thought Keith deserved a chance to make things right. We sat there picking at our salads and talked about therapy. Colleen said she thought we both needed it, not together but individually, to process what we were finally allowing ourselves to feel about our childhood. She'd already looked into therapists and found one named Gregory Potts, who worked with adult survivors of childhood abuse. His office was near the hospital, and he had evening appointments available. She'd made an appointment for herself next week and suggested I do the same. I agreed, pulling out my phone right there to call his office and schedule my first session. The receptionist was kind and didn't ask questions when I said I needed to talk to someone about childhood trauma. She gave me an appointment for Thursday evening at 7, after my restaurant's dinner prep was done but before service started. My phone buzzed with a text from Keith 3 days later. He wanted to meet with both Colleen and me together. His therapist thought it would help him to hear directly from us how the abuse affected us, to understand the full scope of what Mom had done. I called Colleen immediately, and she was resistant at first, saying she didn't owe Keith anything and wasn't interested in helping him feel better about his guilt. But I convinced her to give him one chance to listen, just one meeting where he could hear our truth without defending himself or making excuses. She finally agreed on the condition that we met somewhere public and neutral, and that we could leave anytime we wanted without explanation. I texted Keith back and suggested a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place that was always full of people working on laptops and having quiet conversations. We set it for Saturday afternoon at 2. Keith was already there when Colleen and I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 3 coffees already ordered and waiting. He looked terrible, like he'd aged 5 years in the 2 weeks since I'd last seen him. His face was drawn and pale, his eyes red like he'd been crying recently or not sleeping enough. He stood up when he saw us but didn't try to hug or shake hands, just gestured to the chairs and sat back down. Colleen sat furthest from him, her body language closed off and defensive. I sat between them and wrapped my hands around the coffee cup he'd bought me, letting the warmth ground me. Keith didn't make excuses or try to explain anything. He just looked at us and asked us to tell him what it was really like growing up in that house, to help him understand what he'd missed all those years. Colleen spoke first, her voice steady, but her hands shaking around her coffee cup. She described the constant stomach aches that became so normal she stopped mentioning them to anyone. The embarrassment at the school when other kids asked why her lunch smelled funny, and she had to make up stories about liking aged cheese. The feeling of being worth less than the fresh food in the upstairs kitchen, like she and I were somehow defective or undeserving. She talked about developing an eating disorder in high school, unable to trust any food even when she finally had access to fresh meals, always checking expiration dates obsessively, and throwing away anything that seemed even slightly off. I told Keith about being 8 years old, lying on the bathroom floor for 3 days straight. The cold tile pressed against my cheek while I threw up every hour from that expired lunch meat. Mom stood in the doorway once and told me I was being dramatic, that I probably caught a stomach bug at the school. I couldn't move without my stomach cramping up. Colleen brought me water in a plastic cup and sat with me when Mom wasn't looking. After that, I started smelling everything before I ate it. Every piece of food got inspected, sniffed, examined for any sign it might be going bad. I'd hold bread up to the light to check for mold spots Mom might have missed when she cut them off. I'd smell milk even when the date said it was still good because I learned those dates meant nothing in our house. The anxiety around meals never went away. Even now, at my own restaurant with the freshest ingredients money can buy, I sometimes catch myself checking expiration dates 3 times. I wake up some nights tasting spoiled food that isn't there. My therapist says it's a trauma response, that my brain is still trying to protect that scared kid who never knew if her next meal would make her sick. Keith sat completely still while I talked, tears running down his face and dripping off his chin onto his shirt. He didn't wipe them away or try to hide them. When Colleen and I finally stopped talking, he took a shaky breath and his voice came out broken and raw. He told us he was so sorry, that he had no idea, that if he'd known he would have done something. The words sounded genuine, but I wasn't sure I believed them. He said he was going to confront Mom himself, demand she acknowledge what she did to us. He needed to hear it from her own mouth, needed her to admit the truth instead of hiding behind excuses and justifications. Colleen's response was immediate and sharp. She warned him that Mom would never admit wrongdoing, that she'd spent too many years justifying her actions to herself to suddenly develop a conscience now. Mom had built an entire story in her head about being a struggling single mother who did her best with limited resources. She'd convinced herself that feeding us expired food was practical and smart, not abusive. Colleen told Keith he was setting himself up for disappointment if he expected any kind of real apology or accountability. But Keith shook his head and said he needed to try anyway, for his own closure if nothing else. He couldn't move forward without at least attempting to get the truth from Mom directly. 2 weeks passed before Keith contacted us again. He sent a text message saying the confrontation with Mom had gone exactly as Colleen predicted. Mom denied everything, said we were exaggerating and misremembering our childhood. She deflected blame onto Dad for leaving, onto us for being expensive to raise, onto the world for not giving her enough money to raise 3 kids alone. She claimed the expired food was fine, that expiration dates were just suggestions, that we turned out healthy so obviously it wasn't that bad. Keith said she got angry when he pushed back, accused him of betraying her by believing our lies. She told him he was an ungrateful son after everything she'd sacrificed for him. The conversation ended with her screaming at him to get out of her house if he was going to side with his sisters over his own mother. But something shifted in Keith during that confrontation. He called me a few days later, and his voice sounded different, clearer somehow. He told me he finally saw Mom clearly for the first time in his life. He saw the selfishness and cruelty that Colleen and I grew up with every single day. He understood now why we couldn't have a relationship with her, why we'd cut her off completely the day we turned 18. He said watching her deny and deflect and blame everyone else opened his eyes to how she'd manipulated him his entire life. He'd been her favorite because he served her needs, made her look good, gave her something to brag about. The moment he questioned her or challenged her version of events, she turned on him just like she'd always turned on us. Mom's landlord called Keith 3 weeks after our coffee shop meeting. Mom had listed him as her emergency contact on the rental application years ago. The landlord explained that the house needed major repairs that Mom couldn't afford. The roof was leaking in 2 places, the furnace was on its last legs, and the electrical system was outdated and potentially dangerous. The landlord had given Mom 30 days to either make the repairs or move out. Keith told the landlord he was no longer involved in Mom's finances and suggested contacting social services for assistance with elderly housing. The landlord sounded frustrated but said he'd look into it. Keith texted me right after the call, asking if he'd done the right thing. I told him yes, that Mom's housing situation wasn't his responsibility anymore. Randolph called my cell phone on a Tuesday afternoon while I was prepping vegetables for dinner service. He said they'd completed their investigation into Mom's living situation. While they couldn't force her into any particular housing arrangement, they'd connected her with resources for low-income senior housing. Mom qualified for a subsidized apartment that would cost $300 a month based on her Social Security income. The apartment was clean, safe, and in a building with other seniors. It had a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. Everything she actually needed. Randolph said he'd personally walked Mom through the application process and helped her understand the benefits. He seemed optimistic that she'd accept the help. Mom refused the subsidized housing immediately. She called Randolph back the same day and told him she deserved better than some cramped apartment in a building full of old people. She still insisted she deserved the $8,000 retirement home she'd picked out, the one with the fancy dining room and the activities coordinator and the landscaped grounds. She told Randolph that her daughters were obligated to pay for it, that we owed her after everything she'd done for us. Randolph called me back sounding tired and frustrated. He said there was nothing more they could do if she wouldn't accept appropriate help. They'd given her options within her means and she'd rejected them. Unless she became a danger to herself or others, they couldn't force her into housing she didn't want. My therapy sessions with Gregory were helping me understand Mom's refusal to take responsibility. We'd been meeting every Thursday evening for 6 weeks now. Gregory explained that Mom's denial wasn't really about me or Colleen at all. It was about her own inability to face what kind of mother she'd been. Admitting she deliberately fed her daughters expired food while giving her son fresh meals would require her to see herself as abusive and cruel. Her entire self-image was built on being a struggling single mother who did her best under difficult circumstances. Accepting the truth would shatter that image and force her to confront decades of choices she couldn't take back. Gregory said some people would rather die defending their false narrative than face the truth about themselves. That wasn't something Colleen and I could fix or change no matter how much evidence we presented. Keith started showing up at my restaurant every Thursday evening around 7. He'd sit at the bar and order whatever Carlos recommended, then chat with him about food and cooking techniques. Carlos seemed to enjoy the company and would explain how he prepared different dishes, what ingredients worked well together, why certain cooking methods produced better results. Keith told me one night that he was learning to cook properly for the first time in his life. Mom had never taught him anything about cooking, because she'd always just made his meals for him. He'd been completely dependent on her for food his entire life, never learning basic skills that most people picked up as teenagers. Now he was watching cooking videos online, practicing simple recipes in his tiny studio apartment kitchen, slowly building the skills he should have learned 20 years ago. A woman named Grace sent me a message through Instagram 3 weeks after Keith started his weekly restaurant visits. She introduced herself as someone Keith had been seeing for a few months and asked if we could meet to talk about the family situation. Keith had told her everything, she wrote, and she wanted to understand the dynamics better before getting more serious with him. I showed the message to Carlos during prep time, and he raised his eyebrows but didn't say anything. I agreed to meet Grace at a wine bar downtown on my next night off. Grace was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 glasses of red wine waiting. She stood up to shake my hand, and I noticed she was tall, maybe 5'10", with short dark hair and direct brown eyes that looked right at me without any of that fake sympathy some people give when they hear about abuse. She thanked me for coming and got straight to the point, asking specific questions about what our childhood was actually like and what role Keith played in it. I appreciated that she didn't dance around the topic or try to make small talk first. She listened while I explained the basement fridge, the expired food, the constant sickness, and Keith eating fresh meals upstairs while we got garbage. Grace nodded and took notes on her phone, which seemed weird until she explained she was a social worker, and documenting helped her process difficult information. She told me she'd been encouraging Keith to maintain distance from Mom while trying to build relationships with Colleen and me if we were open to it. She said Keith talked about us constantly, about the guilt eating him alive, about wanting to make things right somehow even though he knew he couldn't change the past. Grace leaned forward and lowered her voice like she was sharing something private. Keith had been having panic attacks, she said, waking up in the middle of the night thinking about all the ways he benefited from our suffering. The sports equipment Mom bought him, the college tuition she paid before he dropped out, the car she helped him get. All of it came from money she saved by feeding us expired food from the salvage store. He'd been adding it up obsessively, she told me, trying to calculate exactly how much of his life was built on our pain. I stirred my wine and thought about that for a minute before responding. I told Grace that while Keith was part of the system Mom created, he was also a kid who didn't know what was happening. Mom was the one who made the choice to abuse us, who deliberately bought spoiled food and fed it to her daughters while giving her son fresh meals. Keith benefited from it, but he didn't cause it. And there's a difference even if the result was the same for Colleen and me. I called Colleen the next day, and we met for coffee at a place near the hospital where she works. I told her about meeting Grace and what she'd said about Keith's panic attacks and guilt. Colleen stirred sugar into her coffee and stared out the window for a long time before speaking. She asked if I thought we were ready to have Keith in our lives in any real way, not just him showing up at my restaurant once a week, but actually being family. I said I didn't know, that he seemed genuine about wanting to understand and change, But rebuilding trust after 30 years of him being Mom's favorite while we ate garbage wasn't going to happen in a few weeks. Colleen agreed and said her therapist had told her the same thing, that healing from this kind of childhood takes years, not months, and Keith would have to prove himself over time through consistent actions, not just words and guilt. We decided to stay open to the possibility, but keep our boundaries firm and our expectations low. Keith called me 2 months later sounding stressed and said he needed to tell me something about Mom. Her house was going into foreclosure because she'd stopped paying the mortgage. He'd warned her this would happen when she refused the subsidized apartment Randolph found for her, but she didn't believe him. She apparently thought that if she became desperate enough, Colleen and I would cave and give her money for the fancy retirement home she wanted. Keith said he'd tried to explain that we weren't going to change our minds, that we'd been clear about our boundaries, but Mom insisted we were just being stubborn and would come around when we saw her lose everything. The bank had already started the foreclosure process, and Mom had maybe 60 days before she'd be forced out. Keith asked if there was any chance we'd reconsider helping her, and I told him no, that Mom made her choice when she fed us expired food for 15 years, and she could live with the consequences now. The bank sale happened faster than anyone expected. Some investor bought the house at auction for cash, and Mom had 30 days to get out instead of 60. Keith helped her move to the subsidized senior apartment because he said he couldn't just abandon her completely even after everything. But he told me he was keeping firm boundaries. He wasn't giving her money, wasn't letting her guilt him into more support than he could reasonably provide, and wasn't going to be her emotional dumping ground anymore. The apartment was small but clean, in a building with other seniors and close to a bus line. Mom complained the entire time they moved her stuff, Keith said, talking about how her daughters had forced her into poverty and how she deserved better after raising us. Keith didn't argue with her, just kept moving boxes and assembling furniture until everything was set up. Mom tried one last manipulation a week after the move. She called Keith crying and said she had a serious health condition that needed expensive treatment her insurance wouldn't cover. She needed $10,000 immediately, or she'd die, she told him, and he was her only hope since her ungrateful daughters had abandoned her. Keith asked for documentation from her doctor, the diagnosis, the treatment plan, anything official that proved what she was saying. Mom got angry and said he should just trust her, that a son should believe his mother without demanding proof. Keith insisted, and Mom couldn't provide anything because she'd made the whole thing up. She finally admitted there was no health condition. She just needed money and thought the lie would work. Keith told me about it over the phone, and I could hear something broken in his voice, like that final lie had shattered whatever remaining illusion he'd had about Mom being a good person who just made mistakes. That lie changed things for Keith in a way all the previous revelations hadn't quite managed. He called Mom the next day and told her he was going low contact, that he'd check on her welfare once a month to make sure she had food, and wasn't in danger, but otherwise he needed space to heal from growing up in an environment where manipulation and favoritism were normal. Mom screamed at him about abandonment and ingratitude, but Keith stayed calm and ended the call. He texted me afterwards saying it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but also the most necessary, and his therapist Madeline had helped him understand that protecting himself wasn't the same as abandoning Mom. It was just setting healthy boundaries she should have respected years ago. 3 months after our initial confrontation at Mom's old house, Colleen and I met Keith and Grace for dinner at my restaurant. I reserved a private table in the back where we wouldn't be interrupted by other diners or staff. It was awkward at first, all of us sitting there with menus we weren't really reading, making small talk about the weather and traffic. But then Grace told a story about Keith trying to cook dinner for her, and accidentally using salt instead of sugar in the dessert, and somehow that broke the tension. We started laughing, really laughing. Not the polite kind, but the genuine kind where you can't quite catch your breath. Keith told another story about burning pasta because he forgot water was required, and Colleen shared about Jack trying to make her breakfast in bed and setting off the smoke alarm. We spent 2 hours at that table talking and laughing, and it felt like maybe we were building something new, something that wasn't defined by our childhood or Mom's abuse, but by who we were choosing to become now. Keith waited until dessert to tell us his news. He'd enrolled in community college to finish his degree, starting with general education classes to get back into the rhythm of school. He was studying business management, he said, because he wanted to actually build a career instead of drifting through part-time jobs for the rest of his life. Grace squeezed his hand under the table, and I saw real partnership there, someone who supported him becoming better instead of enabling him to stay stuck. Keith looked at Colleen and me and said he knew he couldn't fix the past or make up for the years he spent oblivious, while we suffered. But he wanted us to know he was trying to become someone we might actually want as a brother. Colleen reached across the table and squeezed his other hand, not saying anything, but the gesture said enough. I started seeing Gregory twice a week instead of once. He suggested EMDR therapy for the food poisoning incident when I was 8, the one where I threw up for 3 days straight while Mom told me I was being dramatic. We sat in his office with the light bar, and I followed the moving dot with my eyes while remembering that bathroom floor, the taste of bile, the way my stomach cramped so hard I thought something inside me was tearing. Gregory had me rate the distress from 0 to 10, started at a 9. We did the eye movements and he asked what came up. I saw myself on that cold tile floor, 6 years old and so scared I was going to die and nobody cared. More eye movements. The memory shifted and I saw myself now, successful and strong, reaching back to that little girl and telling her she survived. By the end of the session, the distress was down to a 3. I walked out of Gregory's office feeling like someone had removed a weight from my chest that I'd been carrying, so long I forgot it was there. The next day at the restaurant, Carlos commented that I seemed different, lighter somehow. I told him I was working through some old stuff, and he nodded like he understood without needing details. Colleen called me 2 weeks later, her voice high and excited in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids. Her hospital was launching a program to screen children for food problems and nutrition neglect. She was leading the whole design, using everything we went through to help find kids who might be suffering like we did. She talked fast, explaining how they'd train nurses to recognize signs, how they'd connect families with resources, how early catching these situations could change a kid's entire life. I sat in my office listening to her describe the screening questions, the intervention protocols, the follow-up procedures. My sister was turning our nightmare into something that would protect other children. When she finally paused for breath, I told her I was proud of her. She got quiet for a second, then said she was proud of us both for not letting what Mom did destroy us completely. Keith texted me a few days after that asking if he could bring Grace to meet Colleen and Jack. He wanted the people he cared about to know each other, he said. I called Colleen to see how she felt about it. She was quiet for a long moment, then said she was willing to let Keith into her life slowly and carefully, but she needed to see consistent effort from him over time. I texted Keith back that Colleen agreed, and we set up dinner for the following Saturday at a restaurant halfway between their places. When I hung up, I realized I was proud of my sister for being willing to take that risk, for not letting our childhood make her so hard that she couldn't see Keith's genuine attempts to change. The letter arrived at my restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon. Carlos brought it to my office with a concerned look, saying it was addressed to me personally. I recognized Mom's handwriting on the envelope immediately. My hands shook a little as I opened it. 3 pages of her cramped writing, claiming she was dying from some unspecified illness, saying she wanted to make peace before it was too late, begging me to call her so we could talk. The letter was manipulative and guilt-laden, full of phrases about forgiveness and family, and not having much time left. I took a photo of each page and sent them to Russell. He called me back within an hour. He'd contacted Randolph, who still checked on Mom occasionally through Adult Protective Services. Randolph confirmed Mom was fine, perfectly healthy according to her recent medical checkup. She was just lonely and still trying to manipulate us into giving her attention and money. I sat at my desk for a long time that night after the restaurant closed, staring at a blank piece of paper. Finally, I started writing. I told Mom that I'd built a good life despite what she did to me and Colleen. I told her I was successful and happy, that I had people who loved me and a career I was proud of. I told her she had no place in my future unless she genuinely admitted what she'd done and got serious professional help. I didn't sugarcoat anything or pretend the abuse was less than it was. I also didn't write with anger, just with honesty. When I finished, it was 3 pages long. I read it over twice, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it the next morning. Russell asked if I wanted him to review it first. I told him no. This was something I needed to do on my own terms. Weeks passed with no response from Mom. I checked my mail at the restaurant every day, looked at my phone expecting a call or text. Nothing came. One morning I woke up and realized I was okay with her silence. I didn't need her apology anymore because I'd given myself permission to move forward without it. The letter wasn't really for her anyway. It was for me. A way of closing a door I'd left open for too long. Gregory said during our next session that this was a major step in my healing, learning to stop waiting for validation from someone who would never provide it. 2 years went by faster than I expected. Keith finished his community college program and invited Colleen and me to his graduation ceremony. We sat in the bleachers with Grace and Jack, watching Keith walk across the stage in his cap and gown to receive his associate's degree. When they called his name, we all stood up and cheered. Afterwards, Keith introduced us to his classmates as his sisters. There was pride in his voice when he said it, genuine happiness at having us there. One of his classmates mentioned that Keith talked about us all the time, about how we'd overcome difficult childhoods to build successful careers. Keith looked embarrassed but pleased. On the drive home, I told Colleen that maybe we were actually becoming a real family, the kind we should have had all along. The culinary magazine interview happened 3 months after Keith's graduation. They wanted to feature my restaurant as part of a series on innovative chefs. The interviewer asked about my inspiration for becoming a chef, what drove me to pursue this career. I told her a carefully edited version of the truth, about learning to cook from necessity as a kid, about turning something difficult into something beautiful. I talked about food safety and nutrition, about how cooking became my way of taking control when so much of my childhood felt out of my control. The article came out 6 weeks later with a full spread including photos of my kitchen and several of my signature dishes. The response was huge. People reached out through social media sharing their own stories of using cooking to heal from trauma, of finding purpose through food. The magazine editor told me it was one of their most shared articles that year. Colleen's nutrition program hit its 1-year mark around the same time my article came out. She called me to share the numbers. 43 children identified and helped in the first year. The program had connected families with resources, provided nutrition education, and in 2 cases reported suspected abuse to the proper authorities. Those 2 cases led to kids being removed from dangerous situations and placed with relatives who could care for them properly. Colleen's voice got thick when she told me about those 2 kids. She said every child she helped felt like saving our younger selves, like going back in time and giving that little girl in the basement the protection she deserved. I understood exactly what she meant. We were both trying to make sure no other kid had to live through what we did. Keith called me on a random Wednesday evening, his voice nervous and excited at the same time. He'd proposed to Grace and she said yes. He wanted to know if Colleen and I would be willing to come to the wedding. I told him of course we would, that we'd be honored to be there. Then he asked the harder question. Did we think he should invite Mom? I took a breath and told him honestly that it was his choice to make, but Colleen and I wouldn't attend if Mom was there. We'd spent too long building healthy boundaries to put ourselves back in her presence, especially at an event that should be happy and drama-free. Keith was quiet for a moment, then said he understood, and he'd think about what he wanted to do. When I told Colleen about the conversation later, she thanked me for being direct with Keith about our limits. Called.